Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashuddhitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudake Datu Bande Bhagavatan Iman Anudabam Murdna Nipatyakshitu. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana Strinam Dantoy Yacheham Puna Puna Shrimad Rupa Parambojo Juli Sam Janma Janmani Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaritam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Padakamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Yaram Yanikidaga Sangha Shamani Shrotratritim Sangata Yasadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hiraye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakti Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali, and in particular, Sriman Mahaprabhu's celebrated teaching, Tṛṇād sunīcena, kīrtanīyaḥ, sadā hariḥ. So in our previous discussion, we spoke about the notion of dainya or humility as mentioned as a limb of sharanagati, spoken of with the word karpanya, in the verse from Vaishnava Tantra Shastra that our Goswamis quote, and how this was glossed by Sanatana Gosvami Pad as artitva, or a state of being in distress, a state of heartache, and how this parallels Sanatana Pad's gloss of the idea of dainya as acute disconcertion or parama vayagram, which arises either from contemplation of the plight of samsara, or, as we discussed in the last class, other frames of reference, if you will, such as feeling that one's birth is yet to reach success and yet subject to ending at any moment, and feeling a lack of bhakti for Bhagavan within oneself. Such a feeling of lack, such a feeling of plight, such a feeling of unsuccessfulness, this leads to a state of unrest, a state of heartache or distress. And this is what is alluded to by the word dainya or karpanya, and leads to a sense of lowliness and incapacity, which is compared to that of being lower than grass. So, we'll look further at this same topic and various prayers that have been expressed in the Bhagavatam and by our Goswamis that illuminate the nature of this quality or this feeling. So I'll pick up from where we left off, the same file. So I have the following. Returning to Sri Sanatana Pad's explanations of humility, dainya, as acute disconcertion, parama vayagram, and, quote, the heartache or distress, arti, of the awareness of one's own unsuccessfulness, or of one's lack of bhakti to the lotus feet of Bhagavan. It is also to be understood that the unfulfilled longing, or utkanta, of bhaktas for their spiritual object, namely prema bhakti, and in particular, the intense desire, lobha, or hankering, lolya, of Raganuga sadhana bhaktas, for the particular bhava found among a particular class of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's associates in Braja, that is the object of their sadhana, is also a primary cause of humility. So, what we're drawing out here is if Sanatana Gosvami says that this quality of humility arises from a feeling of a lack of success or a lack of bhakti, then we may say that, well, no, what jiva has true bhakti in this world? Practically none. So many people lack this bhakti, but they don't have this quality of dainya. So how is that? So we have to understand from what Sanatana Gosvami says that if this feeling of heartache is arising because one lacks bhakti, the implication is that the person cherishes bhakti as the one-pointed object of their life, or that they have a profound desire to achieve bhakti. Otherwise, they wouldn't feel a state of unrest or distress without having it. And they wouldn't feel that their life was unsuccessful. Just as, in the modern day, greedy people who want to become rich, or athletes who want to become world champions, if they don't win the gold medal at the Olympics, so to speak, they become heartbroken. You can see in these events sometimes the people who lose, they weep, they break down, they fall to the ground and beat the earth and, show such intense feelings of dismay. But why? Because they wanted to win so badly, because they had a desire, and because that desire proved to be unfulfilled, then they feel this unrest, they feel this distress. So one will only feel unsuccessful, one will only feel a sense of heartache in the absence of bhakti if one deeply desires bhakti. So if humility arises from the lack of the attainment of the object of desire, we can understand that, first of all, the desire has to be there in order for that lack of attainment of the desired object to give rise to a feeling of distress or dismay in its absence. So, as we've discussed regarding in the commentary on verse 14 here in Padyavali, and as is generally known, as per the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the eligibility or the primary motivation for a sadhaka on the path of Raganuga-bhakti is intense desire or lobha for a particular variety of bhava. So, if in the, conceptual or ideal example, someone does have this type of intense desire, then in the absence or when they're yet to fulfill that desire, they're going to feel a lack of contentment or a lack of peace in the absence of that. And therefore, we can say that this intense desire can be understood as a primary or a fundamental cause of the emergence of this type of humility that's being spoken of here. So this we'll elaborate on as we just go ahead. So, all forms of bhakti sadhana that lead to a deepening of this longing for prema bhakti, as was discussed in the commentary on verse 14 here in Padyavali, are thus highly effective means of bringing about the steadfastness of humility within the mind, because they nourish a primary cause of humility, that is, the intense desire or hankering for a form of prema bhakti, which gives rise to feelings of acute disconcertion and, quote, the heartache or distress, actually I should cut the da there, when one feels oneself to be still devoid of attainment of that cherished object. So, if Sanatana Gosvami Prabhupada is advising, one should direct the functions of the mind, speech, and body in such a way that humility becomes steadfast within the mind. Okay, so how to do that? Well, what is this humility? It's a state of distress at not having achieved bhakti. So one will feel that distress when one deeply desires bhakti. So if one utilizes the functions of one's mind and speech and body to nourish or to intensify one's desire for that object, then, in the absence of having achieved it, a state of unrest or a state of disconcertion in that absence will also proportionately increase. So, in this way, by engaging in, the primary activities of hearing, of speaking about that aspired for bhava, about the prem of Radha Krishna and their parikaras in Braja, this itself will lead to the domino effect that will lead to the outcome of this state of humility within the bhakta. In other words, it's not that humility is over here on one side and then bhakti or other types of sadhana or something else. If we, look at this thing holistically, we can see how those very things that Rupa Goswami prescribes in the very heart of the, explanation of what is the sadhana, those very things are the most effective means, or are the primary causes by which this type of humility, which is said to be the thing that, guess what, removes the greatest, most unfavorable thing of all, namely aparad. So if one actually sincerely engages in the practice, having understood what the practice is and how it works, then this discussion can show how incredibly efficient and well designed it is. Insofar as by engaging in this Shravan Kirtan, the desire is nourished, which leads to the longing, which leads to a feeling of absence, which leads to a feeling of disconcertion, which then leads to a feeling of, or like an ethic of self-analysis, as we'll get to a little bit ahead, which then leads to carefulness or alertness in one's actions and behavior, which then further inspires one to be more attentive to and focused in one's practice of the primary activities. And then, it runs like a loop, or the engagement in it further sustains and propels one towards more progressive engagement in it. So, let's see how this feedback loop unfolds, so to speak, or how different phases of it are expressed in various prayers that we find in the works of the Goswamis. So the depth of the humility, that is the depth of the sense of oneself being lower than even grass, that can emerge from an intensity of longing for the prema bhakti found specifically in Sri Brajadham, is vividly observable in an expression of Sri Raghunath Das Goswami Pad near the end of his Brajavilas Stava. Quote, "Everything beginning with the grass, shrubs, and insects in Braja is indeed constituted of all bliss, beloved to Mukunda, and completely favorable for his Leela. This is declared by the Shastras again and again, by means of the prayers of Brahma and others. And all of this, that is everything in Braja, is thus bowed to by me with longing." So here we find, an expression which is loosely equivalent to being lower than a blade of grass. In other words, if you're bowing down to it, you're putting yourself in a position that's below the grass. And why is he doing that, or what is the motivation for doing that? This longing, or this utkanta, this thing which is the primary motivation or the cause of eligibility for the path of Raganuga-bhakti. So we can see how these two things are, directly interrelated. In other words, when one has knowledge and thus desire for that object, then that leads to ultimately, reverence for, even the grass within the plane where that desired object exists, such that one feels oneself to be even lower than grass, or bows down with humility comparable to such. So this verse shows that Sri Das Goswami Pad's longing for Braja Prema is so intense that he becomes filled with profound adoration, even for the grass on the ground in Braja, and thus feels himself to be both far lower than even grass and moved to bow down to it. This sentiment can be further appreciated by reference to the prayers of Brahmadev and Uddhava, which Sri Das Goswami Pad refers to in this verse. So this statement comes at the end of Das Goswami's Vrajavilas Stava, which is a beautiful composition where he, as if sort of goes on a tour or an introduction to all the primary sites and primary figures within Krishna's Leela and Braja, and offers praises and obeisances to all of them, and describes some of their essential characteristics. So having mentioned Radha and Krishna and the various classes of gopis and the various sites of their pastimes and Krishna's other friends and elders and relatives and so on, at the very end, after mentioning all of these things, he then worships or bows down even to the grass, the insects of Braja, to say, it's not only, the primary characters and everyone else is unimportant, but everything in that plane, every single contributing member of that plane, which is also, so as he says here, paramanu kulam, most, each one has a very important, essential role that contributes to the existence and the beauty of this Braja Leela, and thus is held dear or is beloved to Mukunda, and filled with the highest bliss. So, he makes this statement based on the two well-known statements of Brahma and Uddhava in the Bhagavatam in the 10th canto that are of this nature. So first we'll look at the prayer of Brahma, which comes first in the Bhagavatam. Quote, "May I have the great fortune in which a birth of any sort here in the forest of Gokula shall occur, wherein I may also receive an ablution in the dust of the feet of anyone there, whose entire life is Bhagavan, Mukunda, he whose foot dust is verily an object to be sought after by the Shrutis, even to this very day." Sri Sanatana Pad comments in regard to this verse that Brahmadev makes this prayer, quote, out of desire for bhakti similar to that of the people of blessed Nanda's Braja, or out of desire for service to the blossoms of his feet. Okay, so, sounds simple, but pay attention. This prayer, which is this prayer to be, quote, lower than a blade of grass, or not just temporarily lower, but to be born as such, that one, remains as a blade of grass or in this lowmost position. Why does he make this prayer, right? He says, out of desire. So this expression, this prayer, or being lower than a blade of grass, is an outcome of his desire for the bhava of the parikaras of Braja. So we can see, or we can draw this back to how Rupa Goswami defines Raganuga-bhakti, and see that when one has this desire for a particular class of parikaras of Bhagavan, the outcome of that is this type of humility and prayer as is expressed here. So that that this humility is integral to, or is, something that's inherent in this path, becomes, very evident in this respect from this reference. And Jiva Gosvami similarly says, Sri Jiva comments that being a soft blade of durba or another type of grass is intended by the mention of, quote, any sort, kimapi, because the attainment of a complete ablution in the dust from the feet of the residents of Gokula can occur only in that type of birth, and because of internal desire on the part of Brahmadev for the service of his feet, which he would attain by becoming a soft blade of grass there, and thus receiving the grace of the residents of Gokula. So I just add this point of Jiva Goswami to make it specific that he's praying to be born as a blade of grass. So Sri Jiva also contextualizes this prayer of Brahmadev to Bhagavan Sri Krishna as follows. Thus, in this way, recounting that is the Brajabasi's tremendous greatness, becoming filled with humility, dainya, and highly regarding even just any of the dust on the feet of those persons, that is the Brajabasis, so as to suggest, only out of audacity did I desire even the service of your feet as one included among they who are your own there in Braja, as I did in my earlier prayer, Brahmadev prays, Tṛṇād, that is, he speaks this verse. So in verse 30, he had prayed to become one of Bhagavan's associates in Braja, and now he's saying, oh, that was audacious of me. In other words, when he contemplates how great these Brajabasis are, then that recognition of their greatness leads to a proportionate sense of his own lowness, or dainya, and therefore he thinks it's fit to take on a situation where he can simply be blessed by receiving the dust from the feet of such persons. So sometimes it is said that humility is a matter of proximity, or a matter of scale. In other words, if all that one perceives around oneself appears small or equal in comparison to oneself, then no sense of lowness or, ground being low to the ground arises in oneself. But if one perceives those around them or things around them to be of very great or high nature, then proportionally one feels oneself to be low. If one, lives in an area with small mountains and climbs many mountains and thinks, I'm a great mountain climber, and then goes off to some, mountain range that's far greater in scale, then they might feel, oh, maybe I haven't climbed such great mountains. Actually, I've only climbed small hills in comparison. So something like this, one's sense of being great or small is a matter of the depth of one's perception of the scale around oneself. So this is shown in this prayer where, he says, recounting the tremendous greatness of the Brajabasis, or because he was able, by virtue of this lila, to recognize how great these associates of Bhagavan there are, he proportionally felt himself to be small or low in comparison. So he became filled with humility as a result of that perception, and thus prayed to receive the dust of their feet, or thus sought to adopt a position lower than even the grass. So in this way also we can say that it's the capacity to appreciate, or the capacity to recognize and understand the greatness of these bhaktas, that the desire to receive their grace or to receive the dust of their feet becomes intense within oneself. So integral to ultimately this experience of humility is the knowledge of the greatness of those others, or the capacity to recognize that greatness, which comes through hearing, studying, learning what that greatness is, developing one's capacity to appreciate it. so a few comments in this regard, but, oh wait, I see a comment here. One sec. What does this say? Oh, the text ran out. Okay, let me just share real quick. Sorry about that. Okay, just give me 30 seconds. Okay, then, just a second here. Okay, okay, and almost got it. Okay, should be there now. So, these comments demonstrate that it is by understanding, and thus intensely desiring the prema bhakti found among the residents of Braja, that even Brahmadev himself, he who occupies one of the highest and most greatly revered posts within the universe, deeply longs for this bhakti, and as a result of his unfulfilled longing for it, feels such humility that he prays to be born even as a blade of grass in Vrindavan, so that he may thus honor and receive the blessings of those associates of Sri Krishna endowed with such prema bhakti. Moreover, it should be understood that one of the primary effects of such humility, as is expressed here by Brahmadev, that is, one of the primary effects of the acute disconcertion and heartache felt in the absence of the attainment of the bhakti one so intensely desires, is keen inquiry into the reasons for one's non-attainment of this. Just as farmers in a country facing a famine will make every possible endeavor to successfully grow their crops, will keenly watch for any threats to their crops, will thoroughly investigate solutions to any threats to their crops that arise, and will diligently execute whatever solutions they find to those threats. So a bhakta who sincerely longs for prema bhakti will make every possible endeavor to attain it, will keenly inquire into why they have yet to attain it, will thoroughly investigate solutions to the causes they find for their non-attainment, and will diligently put those solutions into practice. So this is an important point. In other words, if someone, let's say, another example would be they want to get to some destination very urgently, then if they really want to get there, then do they spend their time going around inviting other people to jump in the car all day and never actually go there? If they actually want to get there, they're not really that concerned with how many other people are going or how many people they can pack in the car along with them to get there, or think that arriving there with a bigger group of people in the car is somehow important. Rather, if they really need to get there, they're concerned with making progress on the road, and as they go along on the road, are they all that concerned with how nice the car is, or how great the AC is running, or this or that? Not so much. If truly they're urgently seeking to get there, then they'll get there however they need to. I remember as a kid, there was one, American movie called Home Alone, where this big family went away for a Christmas holiday, but the youngest boy in the family got forgotten at home. And when they figured out that he got left at home, then the mother of the family has to go through this incredible ordeal to get home as soon as possible, and there's a snowstorm and there's no flight, and she has to like get on a bus and then ride in the back of a truck and then hitchhike, and I don't remember all the details, but she, does this incredibly difficult journey in the middle of a snowstorm in the winter to get back to her 6-year-old son who's stranded alone at home. So, when there's this object of love that you want to love, like, you don't care about how smooth the ride is, or who else is in the car, or how nice the car is, or any of this stuff. You're just, whatever will get you there as fast as possible, that's what you're interested in. So similarly, when one actually really desires this goal of bhakti, then one is acutely aware of the passage of time and whether one is achieving it or not, and one will be very attentive to whether there's progress towards that goal happening or not. And when one can identify things that are slowing that progress or obstructing that progress, then what do? Then they take concerted, effective action to remove those obstructions. These are the symptoms of seriously desiring something, or feeling an acute or an intense sense of desire for something. So, similarly, in the example of people in a famine, when farmers know that there's a famine going on and that people are dying of starvation, then they feel this unrest, they feel this disconcertion that if we don't grow these crops, people are going to die. So then they're extremely attentive to effectively growing them. Similarly, if, the child is alone in danger in the middle of the winter, the mother is, rushing to get back to protect the child. And she doesn't feel at peace. She's not, casually making her way as is convenient, but she's ready to take on whatever austerity may be required in order to get there as fast as possible. And because of this lack of peace, or this, disconcertion that she feels, because out of her, love or her desire to protect and care for her child. So in this way, we can, further illustrate how it's fundamentally the knowledge that leads to the desire, that leads to the pursuit, which leads to recognition of the obstacle, which leads to disconcertion in the face of the obstacle, that produces all of these, this, domino effect that leads to this state of praying, or, sincerely hankering for something with humility as is expressed in these prayers. So, bhakta is impelled by the humility arising from intense longing, thus develop the ability to deeply introspect and identify the unfavorable samskaras and proclivities embedded in their psyche that are obstructing their attainment of their cherished goal, and typically feel an intense degree of repentance for their actions in the past that led to and perpetuated these unfavorabilities. So, the farmer, he's watching his crops, and, where there's too much dryness, or there's pests, or there's erosion, or whatever, he's watching that very carefully. And he, out of his desire to successfully grow his crops, is, able and, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. When he feels the necessity, then he applies his awareness, his attentiveness, such that his skill and capability for problem solving improves as a result of his attempts. So similarly, when the bhakta is very keen to succeed, then that feeling of necessity itself fuels and drives the bhakta, such that their capacity to rectify their faults or recognize and make remedial measures will proportionately develop. So when those capacities become honed in, or when they become intensified, then even Vaishnavas who might be of extremely high character, high education, high standard of behavior, etc., speak of themselves as though they are extremely sinful, or as though they are extremely depraved. And as we've discussed earlier, not because they actually are in in comparison to human society in general, but because their radar or their measuring stick has become so sharp that they actually feel themselves to be like that, even though they might be, far more, filled with numerous virtues than a common human being. So Sri Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami Pad, for example, laments in this spirit to such a degree that he writes the following: I am more sinful than Jagai and Madai, and lower than a worm in stool. So this is a well-known statement. So what my purpose in citing it here is to show the psychological background for how a Vaishnava of this nature can have a type of self-perception like this. With such keen awareness of their own deficiencies, which arises from their humility, bhaktas also come to feel it is even audacious of them to foster the longing for prema bhakti that has inspired the self-reflection that has given rise to their realization of their deficiencies. So this is a little bit interesting. In other words, one learns about, desires, pursues this object such that one, seeks to rectify all causes of non-attainment, such that one recognizes these deficiencies within oneself, such that then one feels, oh no, I shouldn't even desire this object. So it's their desire for the object that led them to the recognition of their lack of fitness to even desire it. So if they had never desired it in the first place, they would have never come to have that type of self-knowledge about themselves and their lack of qualification for it. So should they then, cut off the whole process? And can they? So this is something we'll discuss now. It is in this sense that Sri Jiva comments that Brahmadev's prayer to be born even as a blade of grass in Vrindavan is made out of a feeling that it is audacious on his part to pray to become anything more than that in Vrindavan, that is, to become a human resident of Braja, endowed with the superlative prema bhakti found uniquely among the associates of Sri Krishna there. Sri Rupa elsewhere writes a prayer that expresses this sentiment of self-perceived audacity on the part of an aspirant of the prema bhakti found uniquely in Braja. So this is another statement in the Stavamala. He says, O Mukunda, who could audaciously pray for that prema, upon being touched by even a tiny sprout of a minute manifestation of which the inner minds of sages immediately become disaffected from even the satisfaction of moksha they are relishing? No one. Birth after birth, however, let me just have ever-increasing desire for that prema. So he feels it's audacious for him to pray for it because of the faults or the lack of qualification or worthiness to receive it within himself. But yet, he says, let me still desire it, so that desire will itself burn out the disqualifications for it. But the point that we're illustrating here specifically is another example where prayers, it's felt even to be audacious to pray for this object. So because that's felt, then someone says, well, I shouldn't pray for that. Let me just pray to be a blade of grass, or let me just pray to receive the dust of the feet of the people whose bhava is what I desire. So this dynamic unfolds as follows. This prayer of Sri Rupa expresses a bhakta's feeling of unworthiness to attain their desired object of prema bhakti. And this feeling of unworthiness is also to be understood as another cause of the upwelling of humility, or dainya, that is, acute disconcertion and heartache in the heart of a bhakta. In other words, when one wants something greatly, and then one feels oneself to be so unfit or incapable of achieving it, that causes unrest, or that causes a state of disconcertion. Just as, if perhaps someone, like a teenager or something like that, sees some object that they want, and they think, oh, this is so cool, or this is so desirable, I have to have this, and they become, intensely desirous of it, and then they see that it's extremely expensive and something that they could never afford. Then when they want the object very much, but perceive that they're so incapable of acquiring it, then they feel dissatisfied, or they feel this sadness, or this, dismay within themselves. So something like that is what's being alluded to as this sense of humility, or this sense of disconcertion that arises when one wants the thing very much, but yet is so removed from being able or fit to receive it. And so it's in that very spirit that Rupa Goswami writes this composition of his known as the Udkalika-Valari. So Sri Baladeva Vibhushan Pad explains this as he introduces a composition of Sri Rupa Pad known as Udkalika-Valari, or a vine of longing, in his commentary on Sri Rupa Pad's Stavamala. So this is a very insightful point of Baladeva Vibhushan, as he's commenting on Stavamala when it comes to the Udkalika-Valari. Then Baladeva Vibhushan introduces the whole of the composition of, I think it's 71 verses, from this perspective. So what is the attitude or the premise upon which the following set of prayers are made? Then he introduces it like this, by saying, a torrent of tears and lamentation pour out from a bhakta who has not attained his desired object, whose heart has melted because of longing for that desired object, and in whom an intense feeling of humility, dainya, has been evoked by a manifestation of his own unworthiness to attain that desired object. So let's look at this very carefully. This is very significant because it shows the psychological dynamics of how this dainya of Rupa Goswami is coming into the mind. So, literally, he's saying that this dainya, it comes from swa ayogyata spurti, or when there's this perception or this revelation of one's own unfitness for the object that one desires, then dainya or humility arises, or this distress or this heartache comes. So, fundamentally, it requires, first of all, understanding of the object based on the understanding desire for the object. From desire for the object will come, longing or the pursuit of that object, and then in the non-attainment of that object will come reflection or contemplation of the cause for the non-attainment. Then will come perception or recognition of a lack of fitness to achieve it from one's own side. In other words, if one were capable or fit to receive it, then one would have already attained it. So since one hasn't attained it, there's some, disqualification within oneself. So when that disqualification within oneself is perceived, then there arises dainya, or there arises this disconcertion, this heartache in the part of the person. So very clearly, Baladeva Vibhushan is showing how it's a perception of one's own disqualification that inspires this thing called dainya within the mind of the bhakta. So, going back again, why are we discussing all of this? If Sanatana Goswami's instruction is to, use the faculty of the mind, speech, and intellect in such a way that humility becomes steadfast, then we can see these are all the steps that, unfold into how that sense of dainya becomes, firmly set within the heart. And if Mahaprabhu's instruction fundamentally in the verse we're discussing is to do kirtan, being lower than a blade of grass, then one has to do this kirtan of hariḥ, or kirtan of hariḥ has to be done in this spirit, or, following this line of thought, so to speak. Then it will result in it being practiced with this state of being lower than grass, and in that state of being lower than grass, one will do it free from aparad, or one will do it in such a manner that one purges oneself of the disqualifications from receiving a self-manifestation of bhava bhakti within to the heart. So just reiterating where we are in the whole scope here as we go through these details. But there's more in this regard. Our Rupa Gosvami and Baladeva Dibhushan commenting on Rupa Gosvami shows more, sub-levels, if you will, in how this thinking unfolds in the mind of an aspirant. So, over the course of the Udkalika Valari, Sri Rupapad expresses both the humility of intense feelings of unworthiness to attain his desired object, and indomitable feelings of longing for that object, which nevertheless goad him on to continue praying for that object despite his feelings of unworthiness. So this is interesting. You might say, okay, if you truly feel yourself to be so unworthy, then why don't you just stop? So even though on the one hand he's saying, oh, I'm audacious to even pray for this, on the other hand, there are so many cases and so many prayers where he is praying for it. So it would appear like a contradiction. If you actually feel unfit for this, then why are you desiring it? And if you are again and again desiring it, then how is it that again you're feeling unfit for it? So how these two things fit, or how these are like oscillations or waves in the ongoing flow of thoughts of a bhakta, this is illustrated through the unfolding of the Udkalika Valari. So, for example, according to Sri Vidyabhushan Pad, Sri Rupapad expresses the following verse as a result of examination of his own self-perceived depravity. He says, "Where is this exceedingly wretched person? And where is that which is difficult to attain, even for those possessed of rati? That is, where is the fortune of personal service to Radha and Krishna in the kunjas of Braja? Still, this mighty, unwithering mass of intense thirst excites me." The import of the rhetorical questions raised in this verse is that the author feels that the attainment of service to Radha and Krishna in Braja is most difficult to attain for him because of the great unworthiness for that service he perceives within himself. So he's feeling, I don't have bhava bhakti, I don't have rati, what to speak of prema for Krishna. And even among so many who have bhava bhakti or prema bhakti for Krishna, the privilege of serving Radha and Krishna in the kunjas of Braja as one of their intimate manjaris, that is extremely rare to attain. So I, who don't even have a drop of the actual thing called bhakti, I'm praying for that thing that even so many who have bhakti don't have. So, and on top of that, not only do I not have rati, but I have so many faults, I'm in such a wretched state. So how could I do this? And so he says, still, this mighty, unwithering mass of intense thirst excites me. In other words, despite the fact that I'm so unqualified for it, I intensely desire it. And as we discussed earlier, it's actually the intense desire that is the cause of the self-reflection that leads to this feeling of audacity and unworthiness. So the fundamental element is the desire itself. So sometimes under the pressure of that desire, perception of self-disqualification occurs, and sometimes under the pressure of that desire, then other, attitudes or other objects of focus become more prominent, as we'll see. So, in the next verse, however, according to Sri Vidyabhushan Pad, quote, even after understanding his own unworthiness, out of intense thirst the author again prays for experience of Radha and Krishna's sweetness through service to them in the kunjas of Braja. Quote, O Vibhu, when out of euphoria will the sweet sound produced by your flute, possessed of the superlative dominion of universal sovereignty over the city of all excellent sounds, and fortified with magnificence by the sounds of Urjeshwari's ankle bells, by which an abundance of the trumpeting of Brahma's swan is eclipsed, become the object of worship of my dull pair of ears. So, in verse here, this is verse 26 and 27 of the Udkalika Valari. In verse 26, he's saying, where am I? I'm such a wretched person. How could I desire this? But this desire, how could I pray for this? But this desire is egging me on. And then he says in the very next verse, when will I get to hear the sound of your flute, the sound of Radharani's ankle bells? When will I hear these most auspicious and wonderful sounds? My poor ears are deadened by, the sounds of this world, even the sweet or the so-called wonderful music of this world. Even that is felt to be painfully inadequate or painfully pale in comparison to that sound that one will hear from Krishna's flute as he plays for Radharani to dance to in the midst of the Rasa Lila. So he has such intense desire to participate in this Lila, to render service within this Lila, that despite the fact that he feels unworthy, he can't stop himself from pursuing it. A few verses after these, the author's attention again flows back towards self-perception of his own unworthiness of that attainment. So, how could I pray for this? Still, I pray for it. Then, again a few verses later, he says, Bhata, even one who is most exalted, that is a sadhu accomplished in all varieties of sadhana, does not attain the capability to directly perceive you two even slightly in the mind. Desiring to see you two on the path of his eyes, this creature has subdued and swallowed all his fear and shame. The author refers to himself as, quote, this creature in this verse to convey that he feels himself to be deficient as a result of being of dull mind, of very wicked inclinations, and possessed only of a body made of prakriti. This is Baladeva Vibhushan's commentary. And yet he has still, quote, subdued and swallowed all of his fear and shame. That is, he nevertheless still ultimately becomes fearless and unabashed in this pursuit of his desired object. In this regard, one may wonder, how is it that the author ultimately acts fearlessly and unabashed in praying for his desired object of service to Radha and Krishna in the kunjas of Braja, if sincerely he feels himself to be depraved and greatly unworthy of that attainment? Sri Vidyabhushan Pad thus introduces the following verse in the text as follows. Quote, even after having spoken of his own self-perceived exceeding foolishness for making such a prayer as aforementioned, the author now describes the causativeness of that is Radha and Krishna's sweetness in this regard. So in other words, he's putting the causation not ultimately on the bhakta. Sri Rupa Pad's ensuing verse is as follows. Alternately, what fault do I have at all? But, O emperors of Vrindavan, what person does the ever-fresh sweetness of your qualities not madden? The author's intent here is that even though he feels unworthy of the attainment of intimate personal service to Radha and Krishna, the sweetness of Radha and Krishna incites such intense desire in him that he nevertheless feels impelled to pray for it. Sri Vidyabhushan Pad summarizes the rationale at play here as follows. Quote, the intense desire of a beggar for a pleasurable object is that the cause of which is the pleasurableness of the object. This is the purport. In other words, if someone feels intense desire for something, they desire it because of the quality of the object. What Chakravarti Pad calls in the Ragavartmika Chandrika the ati lobaniya bostu, or that highly desirable object. By hearing about it, desire for it grows. So the ultimate cause then of this audacity, which is perceived as a result of, or if we go back, the person feels audacious to pray for this. Why? Because they feel themselves to be unworthy and possessed of many faults. Why? Because they intensely desire this thing, and then examine why they're not attaining it, and then recognize all these faults within themselves. But why did they attain the object in the first place? They attain the object because of the qualities of the object. They desire the object because the thing is so fit to be desired. It's so desirable. It has such pleasurableness within it. So the ultimate cause of this is not actually the person. The ultimate cause is the incredible attractiveness of the object. Or in other words, it's Krishna himself being the Akhila Rasamrita Murti. It's Krishna being the ultimate form of Swayam Bhagavan, replete with every possible rasa, every possible virtue to the nth degree. This audacity, if we trace back the causality of it, fundamentally, here he's saying, is the sweetness of Radha and Krishna, or the underlying fundamental thing that's generating the desire, which is generating the self-examine, which is an emanation, which is generating the perception of unworthiness, and which is nevertheless generating still pursuit of the object on top of that. The underlying cause of all of it is that sweetness, or is that self-evident, fulfilling characteristic found in Radha and Krishna, or found in the, broadly theologically speaking, the Paratattva, or the supreme entity in its most supreme manifestation. So all of this is certainly not discussed with the idea that then one should become lackadaisical, or that, anarthas within oneself don't matter, or that one shouldn't be diligent in seeking to purge oneself of them. That's not the import of all of this discussion, but to understand that how the steps unfold such that these, expressions of humility and these expressions of longing both coexist, and both at time, according to where the attention of the bhakta flows, come about, and how they're not contradictory, but rather mutually complementary, because they are both symptomatic of the same underlying cause. This is the point of the discussion. So I'll just read one more paragraph here. His point here is that just as it is the quality of pleasurability in a pleasurable object that incites desire for the pleasurable object in a perceiver of the object, so it is the immense unparalleled sweetness of Radha and Krishna that incites desire for experience of that sweetness through personal service to them in the heart of a bhakta. Thus, it can be understood that it is the intense hankering of a bhakta for that sweetness, inspired by that sweetness itself, that is a cause of both a bhakta's intense self-analysis that leads to the humility of feelings of great unworthiness of attaining that sweetness, and a bhakta's unabashed pursuit of that sweetness nonetheless. In this way, both reluctance to pray for the object and intentness upon seeking to attain the object have the same cause, Radha and Krishna's sweetness. Oh, sorry, this clicked off. One sec. Okay, so I'll stop there for today. We'll go further into this. There's a few more steps in the unfolding of this in the Udkalika-Valari, which we'll dive into in our next discussion. So as I said, I'm stopping here for today. There's some more points that Baladev Vidibhushan draws out based on the Udkalika-Valari, which show how these steps unfold, so to speak, in a bhakta's reflection. So we'll look further at this same theme in a little more detail in our next reading. But I'll stop here for today. If anyone has any comments, questions, critique, or what have you, please feel free to share.
Pranam, Prabhu.
Pranam.
Really, thank you so much for this presentation. It's just amazing. My question is rather this prayers Utkalita Varanisa Vali, Utkalita Valari and Stava Vali, and all the prayers are filled with this deep, profound desire and aspiration for something they already appreciate, they have vision and taste for. This tells me that they actually experienced that already. It's not that they're looking for something they didn't get, they didn't see, they didn't experience. Like in our case, we would, my case, I have only faint, impression of what they are talking about. It's moving, but it's moving when you hear these prayers because of their own realization of the vastu they're looking for, they aspiring for this atilobaniya vastu. I cannot think of otherwise. They have already experienced that. So they don't talk like sadhakas. They talk like actually siddhas who aspire for something that they already got, but pretending not to have it, or being so overwhelmingly impressed with what it is that they're looking for is that they realize that the prema, the world of bhakti, is so vast that whatever peak they have of it, it's insufficient to describe the completeness of it. So, are they sadhakas, or are they posing as sadhakas? That's my question.
By they, you mean Raghunath Goswami, Rupa Goswami?
Yes, those who wrote these prayers. Because when they write the prayers, it doesn't seem to me that they aspire for it if they describe the beauty of it. Now, for example, he says that all my ears are so like two pairs of nothing, unable to experience the sound of the jingle bells or whatever bells here, of flute of Krishna. Meaning means that they have heard it already. So in comparison to what they heard, they see my ears and the sound of this world is nothing. So they have realization of something already greater. They experienced it. They experienced it already. So that's why my question is, obviously my suspicion is that they don't talk like sadhakas at all, although they appear like.
Well, I mean, according to Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, a sadhaka is one who's achieved bhava bhakti but not prema bhakti.
Oh, I remember that. Okay.
So, if we perceive it from that angle of vision, we can say that they may have had, or let me go one step back. I mean, generally speaking, we revere Rupa Goswami, Raghunath Das Goswami as Bhagavan's Nitya Parikaras who've descended with him into this Leela, and that they are in no way sadhakas in the sense of those who are not siddhas. But at the same time, we take it that as siddhas, they're also writing and adopting a certain degree of behavior and manner of thought that is akin to that of sadhakas, both for the sake of teaching actual sadhakas how to be sadhakas, and two, also for the purpose of relishing what it is to be one. And that there is some special taste or some unique experience that's had by them in this manner, so to speak. In other words, the gopis are ever engaged in their Leela with Radha and Krishna and Braja, but to adopt this situation where they're as if a fish out of water, or as if removed from that, can also lead to a fresh relish of that. Just as if you're with someone you love and you spend a lot of time with them, there's not a problem. You're happy with that. You're absorbed in that. But if due to some incidental circumstances you have to travel abroad some long distance away, or whatever happens, and you're apart from them for a long time, then that, what they call prabhas, that distance can also create a new sort of reflection upon that object of love and a new relish of their qualities and so forth. That's not the same as the relish that you get when you're together. So we can also say that these associates of Bhagavan, like Rupa Gosvami, Sanatana Gosvami, they're also, relishing this lila in a unique way by adopting these forms in Gora Lila. And that by, meditating on these things from, so to speak, as if from outside, is also one type of, way of experiencing them. So there's something unique, relishable for them, and there's also something that's instructive for others. And thus we can say that although ontologically, as a matter of faith, so to speak, we regard them as siddhas, they also can be described as sadhakas, and that a sadhaka can be one who has had, what they call Bhagavat Sakshatkar, or some direct perception of Bhagavan or his lila to some extent, and a sadhaka in an earlier stage is one who has not. But as we saw in that statement of the Raghuvartma Chandrika that I referred to, and which is given in the commentaries on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu by Jiva Gosvami, by Chakravarti Pad, just by hearing about these things, they become kinchit anubhuta. There's some experience of it by hearing about it. Now, we're not saying that that's complete experience. We're not saying that that's maybe satisfying experience. In other words, the whole point is to have the actual direct, self-manifest spiritual perception of them. But we don't want to be excessively dismissive of even the value of hearing about them using, the language and the frame of reference that we have within our conditioned existence. That's also not zero. There's something there that's of that higher nature. So it's not that a sadhaka who's living upon these expressions of those who've had the direct experience, has 0% experience or 0% exposure. There's something that comes through that. That's, the entire premise of the idea that Brahman is Shastra Yonitvat, or that the divine or the ultimate thing is that, perception of which occurs on the basis of Shastra, or that these things can ultimately be perceived after hearing or learning about them. No doubt there has to be the gracious expression of self-manifestation of that from that higher element. But it's also the design of Bhagavan that he initially comes or initially gives people some initial exposure, some initial degree of experience by these textual representations of him. So for a sadhaka, it's not the same to hanker for something that one has only heard about as it is to hanker for something that one has directly perceived oneself. Agreed, no doubt, it's not quite the same. Just as, if we've met someone and we know someone, then the desire that we might have to see that person or to spend time with that person is different than for someone who's never met them, but might hear about them and think they're great based on what they've heard. There's just something different when you actually know the person and you've actually had direct interaction with them. So we accept that distinction, so to speak, but at the same time, it's not that those who don't have that direct perception yet have nothing to go on, or that there's no value to the desire, to the prayer that they expressed. If there were no value to that desire, Rupa Goswami would have never designed this thing called Raganuga-bhakti. It wouldn't even be a thing, if you will, if that weren't of utility and that weren't actually what he describes as being the most effective and powerful form of motivation towards spiritual realization that can exist. It has some force, it has some utility to it, and that, but underlying that is why so much stress is given to Shraddha, that these things have to be heard with faith. I mean, like really, like they have to be faithfully heard. Like, this thing that I'm hearing is real. It's more real than the sense perception I know nothing of but that. Though like, reality in the empiric sense is, what is known by the senses, these things that are being described by these parikaras, these things that are being described in the Bhagavatam, they're more ontologically real than anything I've ever had the experience of being real. With that kind of conviction, with that kind of firm faith in the content, one is to hear these things. And the desire will also mature contingent upon, or to the proportion of the level of conviction that one has in the reality of the objects of these descriptions. And in doing so, then, this process unfolds, and all the other elements that we've described, come about, and the purification of the psyche, and the self-examination, and the longing, and the prayer, and all these things, are fueled fundamentally by that strength of conviction, or by that Shraddha, which is the underlying adhikar of it all. So we have to have faith in the content as well as faith in the process, and no doubt high regard for those who've taught it and those who are at the advanced stages of it, namely our Raghunath Goswami, our Rupa Goswami and company. So, does that address the point you wanted to discuss?
Yes, definitely yes. And also I would like to add that what comes to mind is the Bhakti Asanjayate Bhaktya, is that just by listening, the eagerness, something awakens in the heart, and to different degrees depending on who is listening. But you said that you have to have this conviction or shraddha so powerful to accept this the expressions of their own faith, to grow our own faith is also evident here. Is that I would say that not even having full faith, but by listening with appreciable attitude will help faith to grow. In my experience is that listening those prayers like Brahma-Chandra and many other prayers, if you listen to them, your own faith increases. And there's something magical in those prayers because they are infused with reality. It's not just some sentiment, it's actually reality that peeks through those prayers. Yeah. That's mine.
Thank you. Yes, that's a good point.
But I really appreciate. This is like so moving. It's just the whole point of yes. I'm sorry, but the whole point of I realized the whole point of studying Goswami's books, especially those like when they go into let's say siddhānta is important. I know, but once you go to like rasa shastra in sense of like lila and smaran and this eagerness, they pray the Siddha Lalasa. All those charged writings, they're not from this world. I cannot say that somebody sat down and wrote down. It's just this totally inspirational, and this is super value there for anybody who aspires for devotion.
Yeah, I'll just add to that there's a statement of Jiva Gosvami in the Durgama Sangamani where he describes Bhav Bhakti as, use the word syandana, which would translate to something like oozes. In other words, that this thing that's being aspired for by sadhakas, this bhav, it oozes out from the nitya parikaras, from those who have it, into them through their words, through their expressions, etc. So it's this attentiveness to those carriers of that object, which is the object sought by the sadhaka, specifically that, right? To focus the mind to hear those things, those words, those prayers, those expressions of those nitya-parikaras who have that bhav which one aspires to. That's where one is, right up against the source that's oozing the thing out, so to speak. So there's nothing quite like it.
Yes, exactly. Now there's something specific to bhakti. I mean, you can study different philosophies, different paths of different style of devotion, this and that. But what comes from the Swamis in regards to like their expression of what bhakti is, the bhakti vastu, it's just unprecedented. Thank you so much. This is really, really, really nice. I'm looking forward to get more. You said there will be more things like that, right? I'm looking for more. Thank you.
Pranam Baba, just a quick question. What does bata mean?
It's what they call a particle, or like aho or ahaha, these different Sanskrit particles which don't have specific meaning but are sounds that express emotion. Just as in English we say oh or hey or ha, or different sounds that they can express different emotions according to context. So you'll see in many of the commentaries on Bhagavatam when, like we were referring to Uddhava's prayers, the famous one that's near the one that was referred to by Raganuga-bhakti Goswami, which will come in the next class, where he says, Aho Ashama Harenu Charanaham Maham, Aho, Charanarenu Jushamaham Syam, that Aho, the particle Aho, it can express surprise, it can express wonder, it can express dismay, it can express many different things. Just like in English, if we say, oh, you could say it out of shock, out of surprise, out of delight, out of fear, whatever. So many commentators, they will give in the gloss the emotion that the particle is expressing in the context. So the commentator will analyze the context, the rest of the content in the sentence, and then infer from that what is the emotion that's being conveyed by the particle. So in this context, where Rupa Goswami is speaking of using a particle like, bata or aha or these different things, then the last one we read, he says, what fault do I have? Bata, oh, emperors of Vrindavan. So it would be, in this context, it would be perhaps what they call, a common way it's glossed is harsha, or a type of delight, or a type of excitement, so to speak, what might be the specific emotion that you would say is reflected by the particle in this case. So I like to leave them as is, because I feel like it gives a little bit more texture to the expression and conveys a little bit of the liveliness of the language across the linguistic barrier. So like that.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, well, let's conclude here for today. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri
Shyam.
Krishna.